June 10, 1944. Inside an American POW camp, Austrian prisoners braced themselves for punishment and humiliation, only to be stunned when the air filled with trumpets, saxophones, and the rhythm of forbidden jazz. What they heard that night shattered everything they thought they knew about their enemy. Why would America give its captives jazz festivals instead of chains? In the spring of 1944, the war had pulled every young man in Austria into its grasp. The cities back home were gray and tired, their walls cracked from bombing and their streets filled with rubble. Shops stood empty, and long lines of people waited for bread that grew thinner each month. At night, the sky shook with the sound of planes, and families huddled in basements counting each blast. Food was scarce, coal was rare, and the air carried a heavy silence broken only by sirens. Jazz, swing, and other music from abroad had been outlawed for years, called dirty and dangerous. And so the only sounds most men knew were the steady beat of marching boots and the hard words of speeches shouted through radios. Among these men were a group of young Austrians who had been sent east to fight. Some had been farmers, some students. One had dreamed of being a teacher. None of them had chosen this path. They were told America was weak, a land of chaos and greed, ruled by noise and corruption. They believed they would fight to defend their homes. But in time, their faith grew thin. When they were captured in battle and taken across the sea, fear filled them. They imagined prison camps of barbed wire, guard dogs, hunger, and endless labor. They expected cruelty, for they had been told that enemies showed no mercy. The ship ride was long and rough, the ocean dark and endless. Each day the men spoke in hushed voices about what awaited them. Some pictured mines where they would dig until their hands bled. Others saw visions of cages of punishment and shame. The thought of being so far from home, cut off from the mountains and rivers they had known, pressed on their hearts like a stone. When at last they reached the camp in America, they were stiff with dread, their boots sinking into the soft soil as they marched through the gates. What they found startled them. The camp was not made of rotting huts or crumbling walls. Instead, wooden barracks stood in neat rows. The air smelled of fresh grass, and the fences, though tall and lined with wire, did not feel as harsh as they had feared. Guards watched from towers, but they did not shout or strike. Instead, they guided the prisoners into clean rooms with bunks and blankets. Food was served in metal trays, hot stew, bread, even pieces of fruit. It was more than many had seen at home in months. The men ate in silence, their hands shaking not from hunger alone but from confusion. As days passed, the shock only deepened. The guards did not bark insults in their faces. Instead, they gave clear orders and left the prisoners to their meals. The work assignments were not crushing. Some were asked to help in the camp kitchen, others to clear paths or repair fences. Though they were still captives, the treatment felt strangely even, almost calm. Whispers began to spread among the Austrians that perhaps the enemy was not as they had been told. Still, none dared to say such thoughts out loud. To admit doubt was dangerous even here behind the wire. That night, as the prisoners lay in their bunks, a strange sound floated through the camp. It was faint at first, soft and low like a breeze moving through reeds. Then it rose, bright and lively, carried by horns and drums. Some men turned to one another in shock, whispering. It was music, but not the kind they knew. The rhythm was loose, playful, alive. It was jazz. The very sound they had been told was banned and corrupt. Yet here it was, moving through the night air, reaching their ears inside the wire. The notes seemed to dance above the fences, spilling into the dark sky. Some of the men covered their ears, as if the sound itself was forbidden. Others could not look away, their eyes wide, their hearts quickening with something they could not name. The clash between what they had been taught and what they were hearing was almost too much to bear. One man whispered that it sounded like freedom itself. Another shook his head, unable to find words. The tune rose and fell, sweet and wild, and the prisoners lay awake long after it ended, staring at the ceiling. They had come expecting chains and hunger. Instead, they found themselves haunted by music. And deep inside, though none would say it aloud, each felt the first crack forming in the wall of belief they had carried for so long. The next morning, the camp was bright with the smell of bacon and coffee drifting from the kitchen. The Austrian men lined up with their trays, still unsure if they should expect harsh rations or scraps. Instead, the cooks filled each tray with steaming eggs, fresh bread, and even a spoon of jam that glistened in the sun. Some of the prisoners stared in disbelief before eating. They had not tasted such food in years. One man licked his fingers slowly, trying to make the sweetness last, while another whispered that at home his family had only boiled potatoes left for the week. The difference cut through them, sharp and clear, like a bell ringing in their heads. As days stretched into weeks, the strangeness of the camp grew. Instead of misery, they saw rhythm and order. Trucks rolled in and out through the gates, engines humming with efficiency. One day a truck painted with bright red letters pulled in, the glass clinking inside. The prisoners leaned forward against the fence to see. It was a Coca-Cola truck, its back stacked with bottles that sparkled in the sunlight. They watched American guards unload the cases and carry them into the camp store. The Austrians exchanged glances, their mouths dry. At home, people searched through ruins for scraps of bread, yet here bottles of sweet drink were stacked as if they were endless. In the afternoons, some prisoners were sent to work in the camp kitchens. They had expected dark, dirty rooms filled with smoke, but the kitchens gleamed with steel counters, huge stoves and ovens that roared with steady heat. Giant pots of soup bubbled, and bread rose in neat rows, golden and warm. The smell filled every corner, and the workers stared as American cooks joked and stirred, as if there was no worry of running out. The Austrians could not stop comparing it to the empty shelves back home, the dark lines of people waiting in silence for one thin slice of bread. Evenings brought something stranger still. The music that had once drifted faintly over the camp now came in full. Guards set up small gatherings where a band would play. Horns, drums, and guitars filled the air. At first, the prisoners stood at a distance, unsure if they were even allowed to listen. Slowly, some moved closer, sitting on benches, their faces lit by the glow of lanterns. The music was unlike anything they had known. It swung and bent, breaking free from rules they had been told music must obey. Some tapped their feet without meaning to. One man even clapped softly until he caught himself, as if afraid to show enjoyment. But the sound sank deep inside them, pulling at something they had forgotten they carried. One night an American soldier passed by carrying a tray of ice cream. The pale scoops glistened under the lights already melting. The Austrians watched in silence, amazed. Cold sweets in the middle of war, while their families at home boiled watery soups just to survive. The contrast was too sharp to ignore. They lay awake in their bunks afterward, the notes of jazz and the image of melting ice cream circling in their minds. They began to wonder what kind of country had the power to give so much, even to its prisoners. The whispers grew louder, though still cautious. Something in their old beliefs was starting to slip away, and each man felt the ground shifting under him. The summer heat pressed down heavy on the camp, but the nights were alive with sound. One evening, the guards announced that a special festival would take place. The prisoners gathered with wary eyes, not sure what to expect. Lanterns glowed along the yard, their soft light spilling across the dirt paths. The stage was set with chairs and shining brass instruments. When the first note rang out, sharp and bright, the Austrians froze. Then the music rolled forward, fast and free, drums snapping like firecrackers, trumpets bursting into the night. It was a jazz festival, something none of them had ever imagined they would see, let alone inside a camp meant to hold enemies. At first the men stood stiff, arms folded tight across their chests as if they had to guard against the sound. They remembered the warnings from home, the voices that had called this music shameful and dangerous. But the music would not stop. It leaped and bent, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping. A saxophone cried out in a long, winding note that shook the air. One prisoner, who had played piano before the war, closed his eyes. He felt his chest tighten and his throat ache. He thought of the years he had sat in silence, not daring to touch the keys for fear of punishment. And now here was music unchained, given freely, even to captives. As the band played on, the prisoners began to change. Some tapped their boots against the ground. Others swayed without thinking. The rhythm pulled them in, daring them to feel something other than fear. One man whispered that it sounded like hope. Another laughed, the first true laugh in months, as the drummer spun his sticks in the air and caught them again. For a moment, the barbed wire and guard towers seemed to fade, replaced by sound and light. Later, in the quiet of the barracks, the men could not keep their thoughts from spilling out. A diary was passed from hand to hand, and in it one wrote, The saxophone bends like the truth itself. No lies, no tricks. Only sound that cuts through the dark. Another wrote, "Why would they share this with us if they hated us as we were told? Why give us joy when we are their prisoners?" The words were simple, but they carried weight. As days passed, the feelings deepened. The men noticed how guards sometimes smiled at the music, even clapped along without fear. They thought of the rigid parades back home, the cold marches, the silence in the streets. Here, music flowed without chains, and it seemed to speak of strength in a way guns never could. The prisoners began to wonder if everything they had been told had been a lie. One man said softly before sleep, "Perhaps the real power is not in armies, but in how free a song can be." His words lingered in the dark, and no one argued. For in their hearts, they all knew something had shifted. What they had seen and heard could not be undone. The wall of belief had cracked wide open, and through it poured the sound of jazz, carrying with it a new way of seeing the world. When the war at last ended, the gates of the camp swung open, and the prisoners were told they would go home. The Austrians packed what little they had, a few clothes, a book, sometimes a scrap of paper with notes they had written. Some even carried small harmonicas or sheets of music given to them by the Americans. The journey back was long, but their hearts were full of questions. They had arrived in fear, expecting chains, and they were leaving with memories of songs and kindness. As the train rolled across the sea of broken towns and blackened fields, they wondered what waited for them in the land they once called home. When they stepped onto Austrian soil, the shock was deep. Cities were hollow shells, their roofs caved in, their windows blown out. Families picked through rubble for wood and food. Lines still formed for thin loaves of bread, and the smell of smoke and ash lingered in every street. The men walked past people with hollow cheeks and tired eyes. Mothers clutched their children close, whispering about what little they could cook that night. Compared to the camp, this felt colder, harder, and far more hopeless. It was strange to think that prison had fed them better than freedom did now. At night, the men gathered in small groups, sharing stories from the camp. They spoke of the music that had drifted through the barbed wire, of the jazz festival that had seemed impossible, of the food and the strange taste of Coca-Cola. They spoke of guards who treated them like men, not animals. Some of their friends back home shook their heads in disbelief. "You were prisoners," they said. "How can you speak of joy?" But the men only smiled faintly, for they knew that what they had seen could not be erased. In time, a few began to bring music back into their lives. One repaired an old piano left standing in the corner of a ruined hall. Another found a radio and searched for the faint crackle of foreign stations late at night. They passed around small instruments, and some even began to hum the tunes they had once been afraid to enjoy. Slowly, clubs and cafes reopened, and the first notes of jazz began to return to the streets of Vienna. For the former prisoners, each note carried more than rhythm. It carried memory, a reminder that the world was larger than fear and rules. Years later, one of the men, now an old grandfather, sat with his family in a small living room. His grandson asked what it had been like in the camps. The old man smiled, his eyes far away. "I went to war believing that music was dangerous," he said softly. "But in prison I learned it was the sound of freedom." His voice lingered, gentle but firm. The room grew quiet as the family listened. The war had taken much, but the music had given him something no bullet or bomb could take away. It had shown him a truth deeper than orders, deeper than hate. And that truth lived on, carried in every note of the songs he still hummed long after the guns had gone silent.